voices. But I came here this afternoon, Madam Speaker, to address a couple of topics, and one of them I want to address is the life and the contribution of Philip Haney. Philip Haney was a friend of mine. He was a friend of Mr. Gomert's and others. And Philip Haney was one of the originals to be hired on for the Department of Homeland Security. And he became an analyst. He taught himself the Arabic language, and he began tracking the flow of people into the United States out of those countries from which came the 19 who bombed us on September 11th of 2001. And Philip Haney's expertise built a database. That database tracks something, this is by my memory, Madam Speaker, so that's my disclaimer, about 800 individuals who were at least on the suspect list of those who might be positioning themselves to bring forth another attack on America. If we can remember what that was like in 2001 and think what it was like for Phil Haney stepping up in a way that he had to educate himself in the Arabic language, he had to understand the culture, he had to understand the history, and then he had to track logistics and other characteristics. He built a database that was an indicator database on whether and if there might be another attack that was rooted in the ideology that took down the Twin Towers and bombed the Pentagon and put the plane down in Pennsylvania. Phil Haney was a patriot. When I first met Phil Haney, it was in a quiet, careful room over here just off the Capitol a little ways. And I knew a little about his story. But when I first heard his story, he was concerned then that he would be a target by people. And he had a thumb drive with a lot of data on it, I don't know how many gig it was, hanging on a lanyard around his neck. He kept that with him, and I understood that that information was also deposited in a remote location or two or more. So there was a redundancy. If anything happened to Phil Haney, that data would be accessible to the people whom he trusted, I imagine, the most. So that was his insurance policy, that he wouldn't be killed. And then over the years, Phil Haney, and I'm going to say 7 or 8 years of this very active, Phil Haney wrote a book called See Something, Say Nothing. That was the orders he got out of the administration at the time, Madam Speaker. And yet Phil Haney had developed the research and the database that he said in the last few years of his life might have, could have, and I'll say that was the words he used, he might have and could have prevented the mass killings, the one in San Bernardino and the one in Orlando that were perpetrated by, I'll say, Islamic radical hatred. But that information was scrubbed. It was scrubbed from the Department of Homeland Security by order from on high. How high up in the administration at this point, I don't know that. We do know. We do know that the former director of the FBI, Robert Mueller, ordered that also to be the case for all of the documents in the FBI, so that there was nothing derogatory about Islam anywhere in all those research documents. That's part of the work that Phil Haney was doing. And Phil Haney was then tracking people with his access to the database, but also his ability to track credit card numbers, phone calls, and those things, so that he could see who was talking to whom, where they were traveling, where they were gathering, and that data informed him. But the order came down, scrub all of that out of your database. And he never said publicly that he downloaded that information before the scrub came down, but he didn't deny it either. He was this directly honest man, and whatever Phil Haney said, you could always believe. But the administration came in, his bosses, and essentially took over his computer and scrubbed the hard drive of the records that they said he should not be following, because I guess it's under a presumption that if you follow people that are, I'll say, associated with criminals, that somehow that reflects a prejudice against their religion. We know that the people that bombed the Twin Towers and the Pentagon and put that plane down in Pennsylvania were all of the same religion, but they were a sect of their religion. They were radical Islamists, and Phil Haney was the bulwark against that. And Madam Speaker, I say this because a week ago today, Phil Haney died, and he was found dead along the road out in a rural area in California with a gunshot wound in his chest, which I imagine was very close to where that thumb drive hung from the lanyard around his neck. That was how he kept that data with him at all times. Phil Haney did carry for his own defense. When there were people that would come and talk to him just one-on-one, he often said to them, "You're taking a risk talking to me because you could become a target too." And he had said to friends as recently as 2 weeks before his death, if there's an announcement that if I'm dead and there's a suicide letter, it will be a fake. And he often said, "I would never commit suicide." I think the law enforcement people regret that within the first 24 hours a story came out that it was a suicide. That has been retracted since then, and I'm talking with people that are in direct contact with the investigators, and that includes the FBI and the local sheriff's department. They tell me that the investigation and the death of our friend Phil Haney, our patriotic friend, that investigation, Madam Speaker, starts with a presumption that it's homicide and works its way through, looking for everything. And it'll be a very deep and careful investigation, forensics of all kinds. I wrote a whole series of questions down, and the response I got back was, "You will have answers to all of these and many more." Well, I expect those answers. We insist that we get those answers, and I do expect that we will get them. But I can't be convinced that Phil Haney committed suicide. I knew him too well. I've talked to at least a dozen of his close friends since that period of time that also said the same thing. The instant the news hit them, they knew that Phil had already prepared us to know that he would never commit suicide. He was a very deep and devoted Christian man. He had lost his wife a little over a year ago, and found a new love, and was scheduled, to be married in April of this year, just a little over a month from now. He had everything to live for. He was finishing another book. The information, the data didn't get a complete dump at all in his first book, which I said was See Something, Say Nothing. And the second book was close to being finished. He was preparing for his wedding. He had joy in his heart. He had energy. He had ambition. And even those that speculated that he might have gotten a health notice that was discouraging, Phil Haney would have used, if he had a terminal notice, if the doctor had said you've got 2 weeks to live or a month to live or 6 months to live or a day to live, Phil Haney would have used every moment he could to complete his work and finish the book and make sure that all of that information and data was in the right hands, and that the people that had it in their hands would know what it meant and what to do with it and who would best put their eyes on it to continue the work that he had dedicated and I believe now gave his life for. When I'm standing here on the floor saying, Madam Speaker, that I don't believe Phil Haney committed suicide. I expect we're going to get a thorough investigation. The evidence that is coming to me indicates that he was murdered. We don't know that yet, but the next step along the way is, if so, we need to find his killer. And so I honor Phil Haney in his life. He was a noble, noble patriot, and he knew that he was using the days of his life. He didn't know if it was going to be the last days, but he was concerned it would be, and it turned out to be the last days of his life, stepping up to defend America, to defend the rule of law, to protect our 330 million people here, and that's what cost him his life, in my view, Madam Speaker. So I honor Phil Haney, and to honor his memory, we also need to follow through on a full and thorough investigation, and then, if the evidence warrants it, and I expect it will, the investigation that turns up the killer or killers. And so my prayers are for the family of Phil Haney, for his daughter, for his fiancée, and for all of those who loved a man that held as a noble individual, a noble patriotic American. And speaking of those folks that really do step up and make a difference in the world, Phil Haney is one of them that's on my heart this week. There's